That was a good clap, Aaron. I hate to grade myself here, but I give myself a 9 on that clap.
It was solid.
It was. I mean,
Yeah.
that was one thing my dad did taught me very well, was how to clap. So with that in mind, let's transition. So Johnny Ferentz here with Singular Agronomics, and today I am so excited because you're kind of in my backyard, but then also what you've done for the industry. So I'm here today with Lance Gunderson with Regen Ag Labs. Just for the people that don't know, let's just go through a quick 4 or 5 minute journey, where you've been, where you're at now, and what you see in the future.
Yeah, sure. No, hey, I thank everybody for being here too. And yeah, man, what a journey. So I got involved with soil testing back in 2002, I think. Freshman in college, trying to get some lab experience. My background, it's funny because it's not in soils. It's what I always tell people, like, my background's not in soil science, not in agronomy. It's biology and chemistry. And around 2010, 2011, started to hear this thing about soil health, soil microbes. There were, I think, 5 people. You know who you are.
Yeah.
There were 5 people
go.
screaming about it. But I had the opportunity to hear about it, and that was really my passion. And it was because without the soil science background, I didn't know any better. Mm-hmm. And so started looking at microbes, went back to school for a master's degree, worked on the PLFA test, which is a microbial community analysis test, kind of working on commercializing that. I did not develop it. I mean, it's been around, but, bringing it into a lab setting. About 2012, after I graduated, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Rick Haney.
Okay.
Sat on his back patio, solved the world's problems. But I was blown away by his philosophy. And so shortly after that, I kind of brought the Haney test into a commercial setting, and we tried running that. We got some, a lot of negative feedback. We got a lot of positive feedback, It was a hit and miss. But I saw the direction this was going. The direction ag was moving. And so in 2019, we started Regen Ag Lab. And really the goal of this laboratory is to work with growers who are trying to transition away from that more conventional paradigm. We run conventional soil tests, but we're not out there to try to market with and do that with everybody else doing it, So we try to do something a little different. Picked a great time to do it,
right there.
Right at the end of 2019, got the keys to the building on March 1st, 2020. I think we all remember what happened.
Yep,
right
exactly.
then.
We all know what happened.
Yeah, so it was great. Started with 8. We had 8 employees, about a 9,200 square foot facility. Yeah, it's right behind my house, so I never leave work. In that time, though, we've now got 26 full-time employees.
Wow.
We've added 13,000 square feet onto the original building. We just opened that up here this last spring, a couple months ago. So, yeah, I mean, things are going well as far as the business goes. And really that's thanks to people like you and everyone else. I mean, because we are not out there advertising. We're not, we're not trying to sell. We just, it's word of mouth. And so it tells us, it's great feedback for us, because the one thing I know about producers is that they're pretty open-minded to try things. I know we like to pick on people, say, hey, no, exactly. I'm not doing that. It won't work here. But really, in all honesty, some of the most open-minded people, they'll try anything. But if it doesn't work, you never hear from them again.
That door's shut.
Right. And so we kind of look at it as a testament that we're getting same people, we're getting new people, and it's a lot of, hey, I was talking to so-and-so, or I heard this at a conference. And so, we're really excited about it. And beyond the business, I mean, it's what we believe needs to happen.
Well, and even talking, bringing Haney more in a commercial setting per se. Like, gosh, I met you probably 3 or 4 years ago, and there are some learning curves by switching from a traditional test to a Haney test. And that's something I really wanted to focus in on this podcast today is giving you an opportunity of, is there misconceptions and or is there certain numbers that we're not looking at hard enough? And maybe I'll just leave it there. I know I'm going to have questions along the way,
Sure.
Lance, but maybe we'll start with just the misconceptions or what you feel, I don't want to say misused, maybe misunderstood within a Haney test.
Yeah. No, so, man, where to even start? You're certainly right. I mean, so yes, number one, there is a learning curve. I would say that probably the biggest step in learning curve is, number one, that there's a ton of numbers on this test.
Yes.
And so when you try to take it all in at once, it's like drinking out of a fire hose, right? But a couple different directions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the misconceptions on the fertility portion of the test.
Perfect.
And then I'll talk a little bit about maybe some misconceptions or where to start when you're talking about the soil health type numbers on the test.
That'd be perfect.
So the first thing on the fertility side is that anytime you send a soil sample to a lab and they're doing an extract test,
Yep.
right? Whether that's Mehlich-3, Bray, ammonium acetate. So really what you're doing in the lab is you're taking a dried soil, it's ground to a certain sieve size, and then you are adding a certain amount of soil to these solutions.
Yep.
And you're pulling everything out that those solutions will pull out. Now, the idea is that you're trying to evaluate what's available to the plant, right?
Yep.
So the overarching misconception in general with all soil tests, in my opinion, is that, well, is that really what is available to the plant?
Yep.
And they're still arguing this to this day, right?
Yep.
Well, you can't use Mehlich-3 and calcareous soils because you're overestimating phosphorus and calcium and those things. And so where do you draw the lines? And it's no different with the Haney test. What I mean by that is that you can run phosphorus with 5 different extracts, you get 5 different numbers.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Incredibly frustrating. It's frustrating for the lab as well because we answer those questions all the time. I know, Johnny, it's probably frustrating for you, right? As an economist.
Yep.
It's frustrating for the farmers. So, but it's the reality of it. It has to do with the strength of the extract.
Yep.
So one of the big misconceptions is that when people get a Haney test back and they see that their potassium number is 100 parts per million, and they're used to seeing something that looks at 200 and 220.
Well, even 250 in my neck of the woods.
250. Yep. They panic and they think that they lost all this potassium, right? And that can cause really high fertility application rates if you don't understand that.
Exactly.
And again, the goal of the Haney test is not to say don't put anything on. I get that misconception a lot. It's like, oh, you're a soil health guy, so no fertilizer. It's like, no, nutrients are nutrients. We got to have them.
Yep.
But the misconception we see is that they go, well, what happened to my calcium? What happened to my potassium? It's gone. And it's not gone. It's just the extract is different.
Yeah.
Now, the Haney test is using organic acids, and it's funny because the extract H3A, it smells like Tang.
Okay.
I don't know if you're old enough to know what Tang is.
I know what Tang is, believe it or not. Yeah.
All right. Well, good for you. Yeah, so it smells like Tang. It's a really weak extract, but it's using the organic acids that plants commonly produce. Now, there's just 3 of them in the extract. There are hundreds of compounds plants produce.
Yeah.
But these are the 3 most common, and especially during high nutrient uptake times. So the idea behind the extract is to, instead of overpowering the soil pH and overpowering the properties of the soil, is to work within those confines. Like, we know Mehlich-3 will overpower a high pH soil.
Yep.
And it'll just rip calcium out. It'll rip phosphorus out, zinc. So we're trying to really get at what's available. Now, when we make fertility recommendations from that as a laboratory, we use the same equations that were developed.
Yep.
So a lot of people think, oh, well, you're making up magic equations. It's like, no, we're not. We're using the same fertilizer response curves. Now, again, we could get 10 people in here from 10 different universities and we could all argue about which response curve we should use and how corn responds differently in Illinois than it does in Iowa. That's not my argument.
Exactly.
We could beat that all day. But the idea is we're still using the same equations, but what we do is we run enough soil samples to compare conventional extracts to Rick's extract.
Okay.
So we know the correlations back and forth, and they're pretty strong. Matter of fact, I present on them a lot. Rick published them back in 2015, 2014. He was doing that work. Now, people say, well, if they're correlated to conventional extracts, why not just run the conventional extract?
All right, guys, we are dropping multiple mini-series on YouTube going over crop management, farm management, all kinds of stuff on the farm.
Yes.
Lots of information. Check it out. It's good stuff.
We'll see you there.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
why not?
Just run
the same extract.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, they're correlated under fairly well ideal conditions. What I mean is within a pH of 6.2 to 7.4, you start to get above, you start to get in those calcareous soils, those correlations fall apart a little bit. So for example, I've seen Malic 3 zinc at 4 or 5 parts per million in soils that are 8.4, 8.5 pH. The Haney extract comes back at 0.3. What's funny, though, is that when I talk to those growers and they say, well, I don't put any zinc on because my Malic 3 test told me it's high, but yet I've got zinc deficiency in some cases, not all. And so, well, if you've got that deficiency and then they think, well, I need to go put more on the soil, right? That's because that's been the approach. That's always been the approach. If you're not happy with the output of if your plant tissue tests don't look good, your yield's not where you want it to be, you're seeing symptoms, the answer's always been go back and put more on. And I, for all lack of a better term, I call it the moron approach. And I'm not calling anybody a moron, but that's just it. That's always the answer. Moron. We got to put more on. Well, when you've already got it in the soil, and we're showing that the extract is saying, well, based on the chemistry of plants and based on the soil solution, you can't get it. Right? And so that's one of the biggest learning curves with the Haney test, is it being familiar with what these, because they are going to look different, especially for your cations and some of your micros. Now, your soluble nutrients like nitrate, the other misconception is that if I would have run a conventional test, I would have a different nitrate number. And no, they're the same because nitrate is soluble. And so I often get told my Haney test, I didn't get as much nitrate. Well, no, you did. It's the same nitrate number. And that all kind of started from a publication that was made years ago out of one of the universities showing the difference between Haney and conventional. Well, what they did is they ran a Haney test to a 6-inch soil sample depth.
Okay.
And then they ran a 0 to 6 and a 6 to 36 nitrate.
Okay.
So they reported this huge nitrate number on this conventional test saying it gives a higher credit. And I'm like, well, yeah, but if you would have measured the 6 to 36
as a Haney as
you would have got the same nitrate. So, so those are some of the biggest issues with the fertility side. And again, it's mostly just what I recommend early on is that if you're very comfortable with conventional test, run the conventional test and the Haney test on the same sample. Now, you don't need to do this on 1,000 samples. I mean, just do this on a couple. And really sit down and start to compare them and see how those correlations line up for yourself. And when we build the recommendations outside of nitrogen, if we generated a recommendation for both of those samples, they're pretty close. Okay. For example, you might be calling for 45 pounds of phos on conventional, and we'd be calling for maybe 40 on Haney. Or maybe 50. But they're not drastically different. And again, show me a fertilizer spreader that you can get down to a difference of 1.5 pounds an acre and, that kind of thing. So, Yeah, I mean, did you want to go into anything more
Well,
on
maybe
that
we'll
side? 'Cause-
we'll maybe hit some of those nutrients and kind of maybe some of my stories with the Haney in the sense of I remember one year, I can't remember exactly, I just remember it was a drier year. Okay, we did a Haney test. And of course, the yields weren't where we wanted to be, and we had this discussion, and maybe just reiterate, that organic end pull.
Yeah.
And the importance of water to make sure that you could actually count those credits. And if there's not a drought year, a correlation I've seen that maybe that 1 pound per bushel is probably more true on a drier year. On wetter years or irrigation fields, there might be an opportunity there where you get more of that release within the soil.
Yeah. So outside of the just ion fertility, potassium, calcium, the other side of this test is an evaluation of nitrogen. And you're going to get nitrate, you're going to get ammonium. And those are both plant available. They're out there. The other thing that we're measuring on this is we're using water as an extract, and we're looking at soluble protein.
Yep.
Essentially.
Yep.
So what I always tell everybody is, or ask this question a lot, is I say, what do cows digest first? Soluble protein.
Yep.
Well, what's actually doing the digestion in a ruminant?
The bugs.
Yeah, the bugs, right?
Yeah.
The microbes. So they've shown over and over again that microbes break down soluble protein first if they have access to it. Now, when I say soluble protein, that's exactly what we're looking at in the soil, using the water extract to figure out what nitrogen is soluble.
Okay.
Now, that includes nitrate and it includes ammonium. It also includes hundreds of other compounds. So we measure the nitrate and ammonium. We subtract that from the total soluble nitrogen, and what is left over is called organic. So that is your protein portion of that.
Okay.
It's amino acids, amino sugars, and all these things. So they're all tied to carbon. That's the organic part.
Yeah.
And so in chemistry, if something's organic, it's
tied
carbon.
to carbon.
I've never understood why urea wasn't considered organic, by the way. Sidebar.
That is a very great point, actually.
Somebody who sees this should take that up the chain. So the microbes are eating this carbon. They're accessing energy. And like most organisms, they ingest this protein and they produce waste products.
Yep.
That process is called mineralization in the soil. So they are releasing nitrogen. Now, it takes a couple things to do that. We have to know, well, how much soluble protein do they have available, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't just measure microbes and think they're going to release nitrogen. Number two, how many microbes do you have, right? And that's soil respiration on the test. So we're evaluating how many microbes. This is a microbial biomass test.
Okay.
We make the conditions kind of ideal in the lab, meaning temperature and moisture.
Yep.
Right? So we're getting this burst. Now, in your soil, where we're going with this with rain and water, is that microbes are boom and bust. So a lot of times they're sitting there doing relatively nothing, and we call that basal metabolic rate.
Okay.
But when the conditions are right, in other words, it's been a little dry, you get a 2-inch rain, soil temperatures are 75, 80 degrees, and all of a sudden they get that rain and they respond quickly.
Yep.
And they start to consume carbon, they start to replicate. Now, are they going to tie up nitrogen or are they going to release it? And this has to do with that carbon to nitrogen ratio.
Yeah.
For people out here that have livestock, and by the way, I do mean kids, you can count them. If you feed these livestock animals something that's really, roughage, really high carbon nitrogen, the composition of the manure changes, right? You feed them something that's pure protein and the composition changes again. And so same idea. So the C to N ratio on the test, when we start to get above 15-1, we start to limit or reduce back the amount of nitrogen you're going to be kicking out of the biology. They have a tendency to tie it up more, and they're doing that so they can access high carbon residue and break that down.
Okay.
So this is one of the big big issues that we've seen with people that grow a lot of corn and they would follow corn with cereal rye. There's nothing wrong with cereal rye, but if you get it too tall and you lay it down, you've got all this really high carbon residue. Your corn gets yellow early, and they say, "Oh my gosh, I got alleliopathy," and it's like, no, most likely it's nitrogen tie-up.
Yep.
But what drives all of this is moisture.
100%.
You've got to have moisture in the soil in order for the microbes to eat. Again, soluble protein, right? So if there's no moisture, there's no protein that's in any kind of a liquid solution for the microbes to take up. And mineralization, the microbes go dormant and mineralization slows and you don't have this release. Now, I've had this discussion a lot and I say, look, if you're under a circle or you're irrigating, doesn't matter.
Yep.
Right? You get into a dryland situation and things get dry. Now, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but one of the big things I get is like, oh man, I'm not getting any of this nitrogen release. I should go put more nitrogen on. Yes and no.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because what I'll say is that if it's dry enough, we all know it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put on, right? That's not your limiting factor. So generally, if your plants start to exhibit drought stress, your microbes are exhibiting that same drought stress.
That's a great way to.
And mineralization is coming to a halt. Right? Good weather makes any good farmer look better.
Oh yeah, every time.
And bad weather makes us look worse. So the same is true for the lab because we are playing that weather game here. But the other thing I'll mention is that I always get asked, well, can I get more than what you give me credit for? Or will I get less? Like, is this, you're giving me this number. So we cap that credit as much of the soluble protein as we measure. So if we measure 20 parts per million or call it 40 pounds of potential release, I don't care if your respiration is 800. I don't care if your seed-in ratio is perfect at 10-1. We will only give you credit for 40 pounds. Because that's all we measure on the test.
Yep.
So, in reality, this is happening in a continuum, right? It's a conveyor belt.
Yep.
So, if the weather's good and you continue to get the rains, are you going to get more than 40 pounds? Yeah. In a soil that's that active, you bet you will.
Yep.
But we don't guess. We're not extrapolating out to say, well, if this happens and if this happens, then you can take an additional credit. Again, the goal is not to necessarily eliminate nitrogen fertilizer in your system. It's to get you closer to that removal rate.
Yes.
Putting on 1 pound or 1.1 pounds per bushel and removing 0.68 or 0.7, how can we make the system more efficient to where you're able to get down to apply 0.8?
Yep.
Imagine, you say, well, 0.2 pounds per bushel. It's, yeah, but calculate that out per acre and 2,000 acres of corn, and that's some serious money. So that's the goal of this. But it's, a lot of, that's why the Haney test is it's why I like it so much. It's also why it's really frustrating for some people. Because they want to get a report, they want to get a number, and then they say, is this high, low, good, bad?
Yep.
Well, it's integrated.
Yep.
Right? So I know I'm on camera here, so this is a little bit of a loaded question, but I often reply with this. I said, okay, I weigh 215 pounds. Is that good, high, low, bad, what? And a lot of times then the question is, well, how tall are you?
Yep.
What's your body build like?
Yeah. What's your muscle mass?
Are you a professional bodybuilder?
Yeah.
Are you a swimmer? Like, what do you, if I told you I was 5 years old, that'd be a trouble. So it's hard to just put all this into one box and just say, this is what this number should be. And I get asked that question a lot.
Well, and maybe that goes into the, kind of that one point we were talking about earlier. It's like, I don't care if you're doing a traditional test, a Haney test, tissue test, SAP test, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. It is a data point at that given time to help you make decisions. It shouldn't be treated as the end all be all at any given time. Is how I
That's
feel.
right.
Because if it doesn't pass the eye test,
Yeah,
that data is not going to rep or show you what you need to know to a point.
that's right.
So it's one of those things that like I said, any soil test is a data point at that given time, but there's principles and there's practices that a person can follow to move their soil in the direction they want to go.
That's right.
And I think that's, we take these numbers and say, I need to change all my practices. It's how I see it is you almost need to understand what the practices are doing, then utilize the test to say, is that working in my soil, or do I need to change this practice so the data is matching what I'm trying to get accomplished?
Right.
So,
Well, and I have that discussion a lot where I said the first thing, and I've heard a lot of people say this. So, the first thing you got to do is identify your goals.
yes.
Right. And I understand, I know some of us listening to this saying, well, yeah, that's easy. I want to raise 700 bushel corn
Exactly.
every year.
Oh,
right?
550. Let's
550.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
We'll start small. 550.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do. And then I want to do it at no cost. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But be realistic. What are your goals? That's step number one. And then number two, identify what are your resource concerns? In other words, what are the things that are there that are potentially hindering you from reaching that goal?
Yeah.
Right? We use the data, these tests and other data around your farm then to evaluate where the problem areas are and where the good things are at.
Yep.
And then in the context of your goals and your resource concern, implement your management changes. Now, I can tell you right now, if you're like, well, look, I know my left knee hurts and I know I'm out of breath when I walk up the stairs, but I'm not changing anything, there's no reason to go to the doctor and get a physical.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're
exactly.
just die hard, I'm not doing anything about it, then fine. That's okay. That's your choice, but don't go run the test. You're wasting your money. So that's really the goal. And then I really do follow that medical analogy where it's, what hurts?
Yeah.
My knee.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what happened? I don't know. But, it hurts. And then you evaluate things and you measure things and you look at things and you try to identify, is it mechanical or do you walk funny? Is your back out of line? You try to do this and then you say, okay, now what are we going to change? So you took all these measurements, say, okay, now what are we going to change? And then we're going to come back and reevaluate. Now, people laugh when I say this because one of the goals of the laboratory, I said this when I was doing the introduction, I said, we want to work with transitioning farmers that have a goal of wanting to change something in their operation. Yep. But we want you to eventually use your eyes and your ears and the shovel and trust what you're doing is working. We're going to try to help you get there. But then pretty soon, we're not running soil tests for you. That really is the goal. And when you've got, if for all of you out there listening, when you think of all the names in soil health that or regenerative ag, you take the top 10 names that are out there, and I hate to name drop, but we all know, Gabe Brown, Steve Groff, Rick Clark, and I'm not leaving anybody out. I'm just naming people that I have known for years in this game. They don't run soil tests.
Because they know what's going on.
And when they do, it's mostly to run one or two so they can have some data to talk about and they can just, it's a curiosity thing.
Yep.
And it's not an ag decision driver for them because they've been doing it long enough. They kind of know. When you figure out what is working for you, again, I'm not saying it'll work for everybody, but when you find out what works for you, running the test is more of a novelty.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and then when that time comes on an operation, having an understanding, you have that intention of, I'm doing this practice, it has this result. Because firm believer, every tool in the toolbox in agriculture is there for a reason. And if it's time to pull out that tool, use it, is my personal opinion on that,
I
right?
agree.
So just for the sake of time, Okay, I think we want to dive a little deeper into the soil health portion. But before we do that, I almost kind of want a little rapid fire here, or maybe just your input. So, you go to the traditional test, you have all these ratios. Okay, you got your K to mag, you got your K to N on a tissue sample, so on and so forth. Okay, when I get those Haney numbers, one of the things that I do is I still see if those ratios are matching compared to what people say on a traditional test. So like P to zinc, if my pounds of P to my pounds of zinc's a 10 to 1 on a Haney test, I feel like that ratio is being best represented. Now, what's your thoughts on that? Do the ratios change when you're doing something like a Haney test, or does it follow the same suit? Close enough that we can make decisions on the differences of those nutrients within the Haney.
Yeah. So the first part of your question, do the ratios change? They do. And the reason for that is because, so you mentioned calcium. So if we look at ammonium acetate and you had a number on your test of around 3,000,
okay,
the Haney test is going to come back closer to 1,000. So it's a third. Potassium, on the other hand, is going to go from 200 to 100. It's about half. So if everything dropped the same percentage, then your ratios wouldn't change, right?
Exactly.
But they don't. And sodium, for example, is soluble. So
you get 100% of that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's the biggest reason we don't calculate base saturation on the Haney test. Everything's there to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that, guess what? If your sodium was 1 or 2% of your base sat on a conventional test and you run a Haney test, it's going to jump to 4, maybe 5%.
Because it's 100%.
Because it's 100% soluble.
Yep.
And calcium, potassium, and magnesium came down. And so it throws off those ratios. Now, again, we know the correlation. So if you're a big ratio person, we can give you those correlations. You can put them in the same language, and then you can use the standard ratio numbers and compare those and see how they look.
And that kind of resource is on your website, I would assume.
It's not currently.
Okay.
It's not currently. We need to do a big website update. But some of this stuff was we were developing and ground truthing ourselves, like running enough samples, right? Started a new lab. We needed to make sure we had enough data to stand behind those correlations.
Okay.
But the other thing about ratios is that I believe, because I've seen it, the farther down the road you move from conventional or traditional farm management, the less those ratios matter.
Yep, I agree.
Ratios in chemistry are incredibly important.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, if you're doing benchtop chemistry and you want a certain reaction to happen a certain way, you got to have all the right ingredients mixed together properly. You got to have the right temperature. I mean, all of that. It's got to happen. Matter of fact, sometimes you even have to add them in the right order.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So that's benchtop chemistry. And if your system operates mostly on chemistry for its fertility needs, that's kind of what you're stuck with. Is that really does play a bigger role. As biology starts to take over, the biology is what's balancing and moving the ratios around.
Yep.
And think of that no different than us eating something. I can take a multivitamin in the morning. I could take 5 of them.
Yep.
My body doesn't just take all that in, right? I'm getting rid of most of it.
Yeah, you'll see it again.
Yeah,
you'll see it again.
Right. So, because your biology has a tendency to do that. And I say that all the time when I said, look across all the natural landscapes. Now, I know natural landscapes, I say this all the time, the middle ground. Look, say, well, nobody fertilizes a forest. Correct. Nobody clear cuts the forest in 2025 and expects to clear cut that same forest again in 2026.
Exactly.
So that's the difference between natural systems and ag systems. But within that natural system, it has been unmanaged for hundreds of thousands of years. Who's balancing the calcium to mag ratio?
Exactly.
Who's balancing the P to K ratio? I mean, and it's not happening, and because that's all happening through biology, right?
Well, exactly.
So So that's what we see a lot of. But again, for the people who really are wanting to look at those ratios, we can help with that. I do believe that once you get further, if you keep going down that path, you're going to find out that those ratios aren't nearly as impactful anymore.
Well, then you start realizing how much these plants and the biology communicate. They help each other out, right? It's just the honest, I mean, that's been proven. And like you said, with the further down the path, or I even think to myself too, you know, if you're using more of a quote unquote, like a compost, okay? Compost, the pounds of phos, I could see numbers bump up after applying that compost, or ruminant manure that's been composted. I can see those bump up quickly. You know, I do something with like a MAP. I mean, I got to put on a lot of pounds to see the number just tick up a little bit. So I get back to how much it being tied up to carbon is just as important. So
yeah, it keeps it in play, keeps it in flux. You know, I've heard the number. It takes around 18 pounds of P2O5 to raise a soil test 1 part per million on phosphorus. You know, I mean, and so when a lot of guys say, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, you know, I've been putting this on, and I just had this conversation yesterday, you know, said, well, I run the conventional soil test, and it just comes back the same every time.
Yep.
Every time. The same numbers, and I get the same recommendations, and I get the same result. And
it's above a removal rate is what you're putting down, because you're trying to build those numbers, right?
right. Yeah, it's a building program that you never get out of.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, that's a great question on some of that. Yeah, like I said, and everybody's at a different spot. And so that's the other reason we don't put like base saturation on there. For people that have been looking at this test for a long time, they would like to see that. But for the people who have seen 1, 2, or this is their first one, it really muddies the waters for them, because they look at that and go, oh my gosh, my sodium was non-existent. Now it's 5%. And then they want to go put a bunch of gypsum on, and that's not what we're trying to do. We don't want to create panic.
Well, I just think that's a good point, and I'm glad you shared that with me. I mean, I never even thought about that as during that extraction process, how much of that's going to be quote unquote through the test. So sodium, if I see a 4, I probably don't, if it's a heavier soil, I'm probably okay. It's just because that's 100% soluble compared to a potassium, you know, that's half soluble.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you see.
Just out of curiosity, Aaron, how are we doing? 38 minutes. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap this one up and then do a quicker one strictly on soil health. So we kind of talked about the aspects mainly of the fertility side of a Haney test. And then we'll do one, you know, a little 25 to 30 minute one strictly on the soil health part. And then Lance, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. Be at Regen Ag Labs, talk more into the Haney test and just your perspective on agriculture. But
absolutely,
we'll do one more here, and then we'll keep people on their toes. So, all right. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you all so much.
Guys, thanks for watching the content so far. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got all the full-length podcasts, other video information, tutorials on there. Also on all the major podcast platforms and social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. So if you like this, go ahead and check more out on all those platforms.